Amelia Catherine spent $340 million on a jet she had never once flown, and still found 10 seconds to fire the only man who could keep it from crashing. That jet was 90 minutes from wheels up when she fired him. Hangar 7, Sterling Field, Chantilly, Virginia, 3:14 in the morning. The aircraft had been stripped down and rewired to carry classified communications equipment on a military flight, and by 5 a.m. it was supposed to be gone. Mason Carter worked alone near the back of the aircraft. He had spent years doing this kind of work without asking anyone for recognition. While checking a panel nobody else had opened that night, he found a small paper tag wedged behind a wire bundle. Someone had written one word on the back in pencil: Grace. He did not know what it meant. He put it in his jacket and kept working. 19 technicians moved around the aircraft, rushing to beat the clock. Joseph Hunter, the operations director, stood near the nose of the plane calling out instructions loud enough for everyone to hear. At 3:09, 5 minutes before Amelia fired him, Mason found the problem. A pressure reading was off. The maintenance log said the system had been checked and approved 6 hours after the actual inspection took place. Someone had gone back afterward and changed the record. Mason said one sentence, calm and direct: "This jet is not safe to fly." Amelia crossed the hangar floor before he finished speaking. She told him plainly, touch the aircraft, and he was finished. He did not argue. He had heard worse from people who understood less than she did. 30 seconds later, her phone rang. Unknown number. Pentagon exchange. She had 90 minutes left before that jet was supposed to leave the ground. She did not yet know the call she was about to answer would decide who was really in control of it. Mason Carter lived in a 2-bedroom rental in Manassas, Virginia, 14 miles from Sterling Field. He'd signed the lease 3 years earlier after his wife, Renee Carter, died of an aneurysm at 36. Their daughter, Grace Carter, was 8 years old and slept in the room down the hall from his. He worked contract shifts for Aerovance Systems at $52 an hour, no benefits, no guaranteed hours. Some months he picked up 18 shifts. Some months he picked up 6. He never asked for more. He never complained to Lucas Wyatt, his shift lead, about the schedule changing twice in 1 week. Every morning before a shift, Mason packed Grace's lunch himself: a turkey sandwich, an apple cut into 6 pieces because she wouldn't eat it any other way. He drove her to Baldwin Elementary at 7:40 a.m. and made it to the hangar by 8:15, never late, not once in 3 years. Grace had a second-grade recital that morning at 9 a.m. She had asked him twice to be there. He had said yes both times. Nobody at Aerovance knew that Mason had spent 11 years working avionics systems for a government contractor called Halden Defense Technologies, or that he had left in 2015 under a non-disclosure agreement he was still bound by. His personnel file at Aerovance listed his prior employer only as private sector classified. Joseph Hunter had glanced at that file and decided it wasn't worth a phone call. Mason didn't correct people who assumed he'd learned everything he knew from manuals. He didn't explain the tag he still carried folded in his wallet, the one with Renee's handwriting on it, the one that read the same word he'd found scratched into a maintenance tag that night: Grace. He kept that to himself. At 2:41 a.m., 43 minutes before Amelia Catherine ever set foot in Hangar 7, Mason Carter was running a routine secondary check on the aircraft's pressurization line. It was not a task assigned to him. His work order that night covered cabin wiring for the new communications rack, nothing more. He ran the check anyway, the way he always did, because a habit built over 11 years at Halden Defense Technologies did not disappear just because the paycheck changed. The reading came back at 0.4 psi below spec. Mason pulled the maintenance log on the tablet mounted near the access panel.
According to the record, a technician named Daniel Ferris had signed off on the pressurization system at 8:59 p.m. the previous evening. He checked the shift roster. Daniel Ferris had clocked out at 6:30 p.m., over 2 hours before the timestamp on the log. He checked it twice. Lucas Wyatt walked past with a coil of cable over his shoulder and asked what he was doing crouched by a panel that wasn't on his work order. Mason told him the numbers didn't line up. Lucas told him it had already been signed off, that Joseph Hunter had personally walked the checklist an hour earlier, and that nobody wanted a contractor reopening a panel this close to departure. Mason asked one question: who actually ran the pressurization test? Lucas didn't have an answer. He said it didn't matter, that paperwork was paperwork, and that Mason should close the panel and finish the wiring job he'd actually been hired for that night. Mason closed the panel. He did not walk away. At 2:58 a.m., he opened the panel a second time and started photographing the readout with his phone, one frame every few seconds, in case someone tried to reset it before he could prove what he'd seen. He had 11 minutes before Amelia Catherine's car pulled into the hangar lot.
Amelia Catherine's car pulled into Hangar 7 at 3:09 a.m. Joseph Hunter met her at the door with a tablet already open to the pre-flight checklist, every box marked complete. He told her the aircraft was ready, the crew was ready, and the only thing standing between Aerovance Systems and a $210 million follow-on contract with the Department of Defense was getting the jet off the ground by 5 a.m. Amelia asked him directly if anything had come up overnight. Joseph said no. He said it without pausing, without checking his tablet, the way a man says something he has already decided to believe. He was wrong, and he did not know it yet. Behind them, Mason Carter stood near the tail section with 41 photographs saved to his phone. He waited for a break in the conversation, then told Joseph the pressurization log did not match the shift roster. Joseph looked at him the way he looked at every contractor who wasn't on his org chart, briefly and without much interest. He said the system had already passed inspection twice that week. He said Daniel Ferris had 11 years of experience and didn't make mistakes on a system this basic. Mason said he wasn't accusing anyone of a mistake. He said the timestamp was the problem, not the reading itself. Joseph told him the timestamp was probably a clerical error, the kind that happened during a 16-hour shift, and that Aerovance couldn't afford to treat every clerical error like a crisis 4 hours before a federal deadline. Amelia, standing a few feet away, heard enough of the exchange to form an opinion. She did not ask Mason a single question. She turned back to Joseph and asked how soon fueling could begin. The clock read 3:11 a.m. Wheels Up was 5 a.m. Nobody in that hangar except Mason understood that the countdown they were all watching was already wrong. Fueling began at 3:16 a.m. Mason went back to the maintenance terminal in the corner of the hangar, the one nobody used because it ran the older interface. He pulled the raw system log instead of the summary report Joseph had been reading from his tablet. The raw log told a different story. The pressurization test had not been run once that night. It had been run twice, once at 6:14 p.m., which showed the fault, and once at 8:52 p.m., which showed the system clear. Between those two entries, someone had logged in to the terminal under Daniel Ferris's credentials and overwritten the first result. Mason checked Daniel Ferris's badge swipe history on the same terminal. Daniel Ferris had badged out of the building at 6:33 p.m. He had not badged back in. Someone else had used his login. Mason widened the search and found a third entry buried under a folder labeled Archive, time-stamped 8:49 p.m., 3 minutes before the falsified pressurization result was entered. It was a login from a workstation registered to the operations office, Joseph Hunter's office. Mason sat with that for a moment. He did not immediately assume it meant what it looked like it meant. 11 years at Halden Defense Technologies taught him that a login wasn't proof of intent, only proof of access. He needed something that connected the access to a reason. He found it 4 minutes later, cross-referencing a separate file on the shared drive, a consulting agreement, unsigned, dated 6 weeks earlier, between an entity called Faro Capital Partners and an email address that traced back to Joseph Hunter's personal account, not his heir Vance one. Mason didn't know yet what Faro Capital Partners wanted for a failed military contract, but he knew a company circling to buy Air Vance at a discount would need exactly one thing to happen first. The flight had to fail, publicly, at the worst possible moment. The clock read 3:34 a.m. Fueling was 40% complete. He had less than 26 minutes before someone noticed he was still logged in to that terminal. At 3:52 a.m., Mason walked back across the hangar floor and asked Joseph to pause the fueling process. He said it quietly, the way he said everything, but the request carried enough weight that 2 technicians nearby actually stopped working to listen. Joseph told him to get back to his assigned task. Amelia, standing near the nose of the aircraft, heard the exchange and crossed the floor herself. She asked Mason who had given him permission to interrupt a fueling operation 40 minutes before a federal deadline. Mason told her the truth in one sentence. The pressurization system had been tampered with, and the record had been altered to hide it. Amelia looked at Joseph. Joseph said Mason didn't have the clearance to interpret a system log, let alone accuse anyone of altering one. He said it fast and a little too loud, the way a man talks when he wants to end a conversation before it goes further. Amelia turned back to Mason and told him plainly, touch her jet again, and he was finished. She said it in front of the entire crew. Nobody moved. Nobody argued on his behalf. Lucas Wyatt looked at the floor. Mason didn't raise his voice. He asked for 10 minutes to show her the raw log, side by side with the summary report Joseph had handed her that night. Amelia said no. She told Samuel Owen, head of hangar security, to escort him out. Before Samuel reached him, Mason said one more sentence, calm and even. This aircraft is currently running under a military security protocol, not a civilian one. If you disable it now, that's not your call to make anymore. Nobody in the hangar understood what that meant. Joseph's face changed for half a second, and Evelyn Madison, reviewing paperwork nearby, caught it. 30 seconds later, Amelia's secure phone rang. Unknown number. Pentagon exchange.
Amelia answered the call at 3:58 a.m. The man on the line identified himself as David Logan from the Department of Defense's Office of Special Programs. He told her to halt all flight operations immediately. She started to explain the contract timeline. He told her the timeline no longer belonged to her. Then he asked if Mason Carter was still in the building. Amelia looked across the hangar at the man she had just ordered removed. She told David Logan, yes, he was still there. David Logan told her not to let him leave. He explained in 4 sentences what nobody in that hangar had known. Mason Carter had spent 11 years designing legacy security architecture for aircraft carrying classified communications equipment, work done under Halden Defense Technologies between 2004 and 2015. His clearance on this specific system had never been revoked. He was, as of that moment, the only person in the building authorized to touch it. Amelia handed Mason the phone without a word. While Mason spoke with David Logan, Evelyn Madison pulled Joseph Hunter's login history a second time and found something she'd missed the first pass. The 8:49 p.m. session from his workstation had lasted 6 minutes, long enough to overwrite the pressurization result and close out the log before anyone else came on shift.
She also found the consulting agreement Mason had flagged earlier, now cross-referenced against a public filing. Faro Capital Partners had made 2 prior acquisitions in the last 3 years, both of defense contractors that lost major government contracts within weeks of a safety failure. Both purchases had closed at less than 60% of the company's prior valuation. Aerovan Systems was worth $1.1 billion with its DoD contract intact. Without it, analysts had already estimated a drop below $600 million. Joseph Hunter was not just protecting a mistake, he had built one. At 4:06 a.m., Samuel Owen sealed every exit in the hangar under David Logan's direct order. Joseph Hunter had 54 minutes before the review team from Quantico arrived to take possession of every device in the building. David Logan stayed on the line while Mason worked. At 4:11 a.m., Mason isolated the falsified log entry and matched it keystroke for keystroke against the login session from Joseph Hunter's workstation. Evelyn Madison printed the comparison and set it on the table in front of Amelia without saying a word. She didn't need to. Amelia asked Joseph one question. Why had the corrected log been created from his account 7 minutes after the original fault first appeared? Joseph said it was a mistake, that someone else must have used his login, that he'd stepped away from his desk that evening. Mason, still standing near the terminal, said the workstation required a badge tap to unlock, and Joseph's badge had swiped into the operations office at 8:47 p.m., 2 minutes before the session began. Joseph stopped talking. At 4:21 a.m., Samuel Owen's team found a second device in the technical office, a personal laptop connected to an external drive that had started transferring files the moment security sealed the building. Mason recognized what it was immediately, an attempt to push a fabricated record showing that he, not Joseph, had tampered with the aircraft. Samuel's team disconnected it in time. Lucas Wyatt came forward on his own at 4:24 a.m. He told Amelia that Joseph had asked him months earlier to ignore a minor discrepancy on a different flight and log it as resolved. Lucas said he hadn't understood what it was building towards. Nobody made him say it. He said it because Mason had asked him for nothing but the truth, and it was the first time in months anyone had asked him for that. David Logan confirmed over the phone that federal investigators would take Joseph Hunter's devices and the Faro Capital Partners filing into evidence within the hour. Amelia stood in her own hangar, looking at the man she had ordered removed less than an hour ago, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him what he needed from her to get the aircraft safely cleared. She did not ask him to forgive her. She asked him to let her help.
Mason worked through the final restoration for the next 31 minutes. At 4:47 a.m., a second lock appeared in the authentication sequence, one Joseph had built in months earlier as a failsafe of his own. If disabled the wrong way, it would log the failure under Mason's credentials instead of Joseph's. Mason recognized it for what it was and disconnected the correct branch on the first try, the same method he'd used on a communications aircraft in 2011, a job he was still not permitted to discuss by name. Amelia stood beside him this time, instead of behind him. At 4:52 a.m., the pilot confirmed full system clearance. David Logan verified it independently from Washington 2 minutes later. The aircraft departed Sterling Field at 5:04 a.m., 4 minutes behind schedule, carrying no unresolved faults and no falsified records. Joseph Hunter was taken into federal custody at 5:20 a.m. Investigators later confirmed the consulting agreement with Faro Capital Partners had been signed 8 weeks before that night, and that a second sabotage attempt had been planned for a follow-up flight in October had the first one gone undetected. Lucas Wyatt kept his job. He was reassigned, at his own request, to work directly under Mason on safety verification. Amelia offered Mason a permanent position overseeing independent safety review for every Aerovance flight tied to a federal contract. He didn't accept it that morning.
He asked for 2 days to think it over and a contract that spelled out exactly what the role did and didn't cover. Amelia agreed without argument. At 9 a.m. that same day, Mason walked into Baldwin Elementary and sat in the 3rd row for Grace's recital, 11 minutes late, still in the same jacket he'd worn in the hangar. Grace didn't ask why he looked tired. She waved at him from the stage, and he waved back. He never told her that the word on the maintenance tag in his pocket was the same as her name. He didn't need to. It had already done its job, reminding him at 3 in the morning exactly why the truth was worth the 10 minutes it took to prove it. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's ever been underestimated at work. Let us know in the comments, has someone ever misjudged you before finding out who you really were? And if you want more stories like Mason's, subscribe. The next one starts where you'd least expect it.